I spent my last £5 on a carriage I intended to live in. What I found hidden beneath its velvet seat would change my life forever. My name is Eloise Whitmore, and on that cold November morning in 1897, I became homeless for the first time in my 31 years of life. The sky above London was the color of wet slate, heavy with the promise of rain. A bitter wind swept through the narrow streets, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke. I stood outside the boarding house on Merton Street with a single traveling case in my hand and exactly £5 and 3 shillings to my name. Mrs. Bancroft, the landlady, had not been cruel about my eviction. She had simply stated the facts. I had been behind on rent for 2 months. Lady Cresswell, my former employer, had died without leaving me so much as a letter of reference. The room was needed for a paying tenant. I had until noon to collect my things. I had served Lady Cresswell for 7 years as her companion and personal secretary. 7 years of reading to her every evening from the novels she loved. 7 years of writing her correspondence when her hands grew too weak to hold a pen. 7 years of sitting beside her during her final illness, holding her papery fingers as she slipped between sleep and waking. When she finally passed on a gray Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, I had closed her eyes and wept as though I had lost my own mother. Perhaps, in a way, I had. My own mother had died when I was 19, and Lady Cresswell had been the closest thing to family I had known in the 12 years since. Her nephew, Mr. Geoffrey Aldridge, arrived from Edinburgh within days of the funeral. He surveyed the household with the cold efficiency of an accountant, tallying the silver and paintings with far more care than he showed for the servants. He dismissed every one of us within the week. 1 month's wages and nothing more. That money had seemed like a fortune at first. But rent in London is not cheap, and I had needed new boots and food and coal for the meager fire that barely warmed my rented room. By the time Mrs. Bancroft knocked on my door with the eviction notice, I had almost nothing left. I walked through the streets that morning with no destination. My parents had died when I was 19, leaving debts rather than inheritance. I had no suitors, for what man of respectable position would court a woman without dowry or family connections? I had no friends with spare rooms. I was educated beyond my station, able to discuss philosophy and play the pianoforte with ease. None of these accomplishments would keep me warm tonight. It was the rain that drove me toward the auction house on Belford Lane. The downpour began suddenly, emptying the streets within minutes. I ducked under the nearest awning and pressed myself against the cold brick wall. That was when I heard the auctioneer's voice through the open doors. Carriage auction, the sign read. Unclaimed and abandoned vehicles. All sales final. Something compelled me to enter. I found myself standing at the back of a crowded room filled with men in dark coats, their breath visible in the chill air. The carriages were lined up in the yard behind the building. Landaus and broughams and phaetons, the conveyances of wealthy families who had fallen on hard times. The bids climbed quickly. £20, 50, 100. An hour passed, then 2. The crowd thinned as the finer carriages were sold. The rain stopped, leaving the cobblestones glistening. I was about to leave when the auctioneer called out the final lot. "And now, gentlemen," he announced, "we come to item 47, a state carriage of considerable age, origin unknown, condition poor. The records indicate it was discovered in a warehouse belonging to a deceased collector. Starting bid is £1. The carriage was wheeled into view, and several men laughed. It was enormous, with a body that had once been painted royal blue, but had faded to the color of a bruised sky. The gilt trim was tarnished. 2 windows were cracked. The velvet curtains hung in tatters. The lanterns were bent and broken. £1, the auctioneer repeated. Do I hear £1? The room was silent. I stared at the carriage and thought about the streets outside. I thought about the size of that carriage, large enough for a woman to lie down inside, large enough to live in. My hand rose before I could stop it. £1, I called out, and every head turned. The auctioneer blinked. The lady bids £1. Do I hear 2? No one spoke. I kept my hand raised and my chin high. £1, going once, going twice. Sold to the lady in the gray coat. I made my way to the payment desk. I handed over my pound coin and waited while the assistant recorded the sale. There is the matter of storage fees, he said. The carriage has been in our warehouse for some time. The fees come to £3 and 12 shillings. My stomach dropped. Added to the £1 for the carriage, that was £4 and 12 shillings. Nearly everything I possessed. But what choice did I have? I counted out the coins with trembling fingers. The carriage is yours, madam. You have until tomorrow evening to remove it from the premises. I found my carriage in the corner of the auction yard, looking even more decrepit up close. The paint was peeling in long strips. The brass fittings were green with age. The door hung crooked on its hinges, but the wheels were solid, and when I climbed inside, I found the interior larger than expected. 2 long benches faced each other, upholstered in velvet the color of old wine. The ceiling was high enough that I could sit upright. A small compartment near the door held a tarnished mirror. I sat down and allowed myself, for the first time that day, to cry. When my tears were spent, I spent my last 11 shillings on a bucket, a brush, lye soap, a candle, and bread. Then I returned and began to clean. I worked through the afternoon and into the evening, scrubbing until my arms ached. I swept the floor. I removed the tattered curtains and shook out clouds of dust. By nearly midnight, the interior smelled of soap instead of mold. The velvet revealed itself to be a deep burgundy, still beautiful despite its wear. That was when I noticed something strange. While cleaning the right-hand bench, my brush caught on something unusual. The velvet was slightly raised, as though something lay beneath it. I pressed my hand against the fabric and felt a hard edge. My heart began to race. I searched for a seam and pulled at the fabric until it gave way. Beneath the velvet was a wooden panel. Beneath the panel was a secret compartment. And inside, wrapped in silk the color of faded cream, was the most beautiful object I had ever seen. It was a tiara. Even in the dim moonlight, it blazed like captured starlight. Diamonds clustered in intricate patterns, forming flowers and leaves that seemed almost alive. The metalwork was delicate beyond belief. I lifted it from its hiding place and felt its weight, heavier than expected, solid and real. I sat in the darkness, holding a fortune, and I could not breathe. Lady Cresswell had loved gossip about the aristocracy. She had told me every scandal, every whispered secret. And one story she told more often than any other was the tale of the Pemberton tiara. It had vanished in 1857, 40 years ago, on the night of a grand ball at Buckingham Palace. The tiara had been a gift from Prince Albert to Queen Victoria, crafted by the finest jewelers in Europe and worth more than most estates. The last person seen with access to it was the Duke of Ashworth, Roland Pemberton, tasked with returning it to the royal vault. The tiara never reached the vault. Roland Pemberton claimed he had handed it to a footman, but the footman was never found. The palace was searched, every servant questioned, every guest scrutinized, but the tiara vanished completely. Roland Pemberton was never formally charged, for there was no evidence beyond his presence in the wrong place. But society needed a villain. The whispers followed him everywhere. Within a year, he fled to the continent, where he died a decade later, still proclaiming innocence. His son inherited the title and the shame. His grandson inherited them in turn. 3 generations of Pembertons had lived under that shadow, and now the tiara was here, in my hands, hidden in a carriage I bought for £5. The auction record said the provenance was unclear, found in a deceased collector's warehouse. But looking at the royal blue paint and gilt trim, the size far too grand for common use, I knew what this was. A royal carriage. This had belonged to the palace. This was where the tiara had been hidden 40 years ago by someone who knew its secret compartment. Not Roland Pemberton. He had been innocent. Someone else stole the tiara. Someone else hid it here. And for reasons I could not imagine, that someone never returned to claim their prize, I could sell it. Find a discreet buyer who asked no questions. I would have enough money to live comfortably forever. I would never be cold or hungry again. But even as the thoughts formed, I knew I could not. The tiara did not belong to me. The Pembertons had suffered 40 years because of this glittering thing. If I sold it in secret, their suffering would continue. Their name would never be cleared. I could not build my comfort on another family's pain. But I was not foolish either. I had no proof of how I came to possess it, no witnesses. If I walked into a police station, I would likely be arrested. The authorities would never believe a homeless governess stumbled upon a £1 million treasure in a carriage bought at auction. They would throw me in prison, and the truth would be lost forever. I needed to be careful. I needed to understand how the tiara came to be hidden here and why it remained 40 years. And I needed to find the Pembertons. I tucked the treasure back into its compartment and covered it with the torn velvet. Then I lay down on the opposite bench, pulled my coat over my shoulders, and stared at the ceiling until sleep claimed me. That night, I dreamed of a palace ballroom filled with dancing figures in white and gold. I dreamed of a woman in a crown of stars, turning to look at me with eyes that held 40 years of secrets. I dreamed of a man's voice calling my name. When I woke, dawn was creeping through the windows, and I knew what I had to do. I would find Nathaniel Pemberton, the current Duke of Ashworth. I would tell him what I had found, and together, we would uncover the truth buried for 40 years. I did not know then what that decision would cost me. I did not know that Nathaniel Pemberton was not the cold, distant aristocrat I imagined. I did not know that his gray eyes would haunt my dreams, or that his voice would make my heart race in ways I had never experienced. I did not know that by the time the truth was revealed, I would have lost my heart completely. But perhaps it is better we do not know the future. Perhaps it is better we step into the unknown with only hope to guide us. I rose from my bench, straightened my rumpled coat, and began to plan. The morning light revealed my situation with harsh clarity. I was a woman alone in London with no money, no connections, and a priceless tiara hidden in a carriage I could not move. The auction yard would expect me gone by evening. I needed help, but I could not trust just anyone with my secret. I thought about what I knew of the Pembertons. Lady Cresswell had spoken of them occasionally, always with a mixture of pity and fascination.
What was that?
The current Duke, Nathaniel Pemberton, was said to be a man of 35 who had inherited the title 5 years ago when his father died. He lived at Ashworth House in Mayfair, one of the few properties the family had managed to retain despite their reduced circumstances. The scandal had cost them dearly over the decades. They had sold estates, dismissed servants, retreated from society, and yet they had never sold Ashworth House. Lady Cresswell had found that curious. "It is as if they are waiting for something," she had said once, "as if they believe that one day the truth will come out and they will need a proper London home to return to society from." I understood that now. The Pembertons had been waiting for exactly what I had found, but how to approach them? I could not simply walk up to the front door of a duke's residence and announce that I had found the missing tiara. The servants would turn me away. The authorities would be called. I would be arrested before I could explain. I needed to find a way to make Nathaniel Pemberton come to me. The answer came to me as I sat in my carriage, watching the auction yard workers begin their morning routines. The carriage itself was the key. It had once belonged to the royal household. Its provenance could be traced, its history verified. If I could prove that this was a royal carriage, if I could connect it to the night the tiara disappeared, then I would have evidence that supported my story. I needed to go to the auction house records. I needed to find out everything I could about where this carriage had come from. I climbed out of my carriage and made my way to the auction house offices, a small brick building adjacent to the main hall. The door was unlocked, and I found the same young assistant from yesterday sitting behind a cluttered desk, a cup of tea steaming in his hand. "Excuse me," I said. "I purchased item 47 yesterday, the state carriage. I was hoping to learn more about its history." He looked up at me with the same expression of bemused curiosity I had seen from everyone at the auction. "You are the lady who bought it." "I remember." He set down his tea and began rifling through a stack of papers. "Let me see. Item 47. Here it is." He pulled out a single sheet of paper and studied it with a frown. "Not much here, I am afraid. The carriage was discovered in a warehouse in Southwark. The warehouse belonged to a man named Cornelius Blackwood, deceased 6 months ago. His estate was being liquidated, and we were contracted to sell off the contents. There were quite a few odd items in that warehouse, actually. The old fellow seems to have been something of a collector. Cornelius Blackwood. I committed the name to memory. Do you have an address for the warehouse?" The assistant hesitated, but something in my expression must have convinced him I was harmless. "I suppose there is no harm in it." He copied an address onto a scrap of paper and handed it to me. "There you are, though I doubt you will find anything useful." The place was cleared out completely. I thanked him and left. The address led me to a narrow street near the river, where the smell of the Thames hung heavy in the air. The warehouse was a squat brick building with boarded windows and a padlock on the door. A sign on the front read, "Property of Blackwood Estate. Inquiries to Messrs. Thornton and Associates, Solicitors." I stood on the pavement and stared at the building for a long moment. Cornelius Blackwood, a collector, a man who had somehow acquired a royal carriage and stored it in a warehouse for decades. Who was he? How had he come to possess the carriage? And had he known what was hidden inside? I needed to find out more about this Cornelius Blackwood, and I knew exactly where to start. The British Library was a vast stone edifice that I had visited many times during my years with Lady Cresswell. She had sent me there often to research genealogies and historical matters for her correspondence. I knew the reading rooms well, knew which clerks were helpful and which were best avoided, knew how to navigate the endless stacks of periodicals and records. I spent the remainder of that morning and most of the afternoon searching for any mention of Cornelius Blackwood. What I found painted a picture of a strange and solitary man. He had been a dealer in antiquities, specializing in objects connected to the royal family. He had operated from that warehouse in Southwark for nearly 50 years, buying and selling historical curiosities to collectors and museums. He had never married, had no children, and had lived alone above his warehouse until his death. But one detail caught my attention more than any other. In 1857, the year the Tiara disappeared, Cornelius Blackwood had been employed at Buckingham Palace. He had worked as an assistant to the Master of the Horse, responsible for maintaining the royal carriages. I sat back in my chair and let out a long breath. Cornelius Blackwood had access to the carriages. Cornelius Blackwood had access to the tiara. Cornelius Blackwood had hidden the treasure in a secret compartment he almost certainly knew existed. But why had he never retrieved it? Why had he left £1 million sitting in a warehouse for 40 years? There was only one person who might know the answers to those questions, and tomorrow morning I would find a way to meet him. Tomorrow I would go to Ashworth House and find the Duke. I had imagined 100 ways my first meeting with the Duke of Ashworth might unfold. None of them included being mistaken for a thief. The morning after my discovery at the British Library, I woke in my carriage to the sound of rain drumming against the roof. I had managed to move the carriage the previous evening, paying a pair of dock workers a few pennies I had found in the lining of my coat to help me push it to a quiet alley behind a church. It was not an ideal location, but it was sheltered from the worst of the weather and far enough from the main streets that I hoped no one would notice me. I had spent much of the night thinking about how to approach the Duke. I could not simply walk up to his front door and announce that I had found the missing tiara. A woman in my condition, wearing a coat that had seen better days and boots that were held together more by hope than leather, would be turned away before she could speak a single word. servants were trained to recognize quality, and I no longer possessed any. But I had one advantage. I knew how to behave in a great house. I knew how servants moved and spoke and thought. I had spent 7 years navigating the delicate hierarchies of Lady Cresswell's household, learning when to be visible and when to be invisible, when to speak and when to remain silent. If I could not enter Ashworth House as a guest, perhaps I could enter as something else. The idea came to me as I lay in the darkness, listening to the rain. Ashworth House, like all great houses, would have a servant's entrance. And servants' entrances were always busy in the morning, with deliveries arriving and tradespeople coming and going. If I timed it correctly, if I dressed the part and carried myself with the right combination of purpose and deference, I might be able to slip inside. It was a foolish plan. It was almost certainly doomed to fail. But I had no better options, and I could not remain in this alley forever. I rose at dawn and prepared myself as best I could. I washed my face with rainwater collected in my bucket. I brushed my hair until it shone and pinned it up in the simple style favored by upper servants. I straightened my coat and cleaned my boots with a rag. I looked at myself in the tarnished mirror I had found in the carriage and saw a woman who might, in the right light, pass for a respectable lady's maid seeking a position. It would have to be enough. Ashworth House stood in the heart of Mayfair, on a quiet square lined with elm trees that had shed their leaves for winter. It was a handsome Georgian building, 4 stories of pale stone with tall windows and a black iron fence surrounding a small front garden. Compared to the grand mansions on Park Lane, it was modest, but it still radiated the quiet dignity of old money and older blood. I walked past the front entrance without slowing, my heart pounding against my ribs. A footman stood at the door, resplendent in dark green livery, and I knew he would never let me pass. Instead, I continued around the corner to the narrow lane that ran behind the row of houses. There, just as I had hoped, I found the servants' entrance, a plain wooden door set into a high brick wall, propped open to allow the morning deliveries. A cart was pulled up to the door, and 2 men were unloading crates of vegetables while a harried-looking woman in a cook's apron directed them. No one paid any attention to me as I slipped past and through the door into the courtyard beyond. The servants' quarters of Ashworth House were much like those of any great house, a warren of corridors and small rooms, bustling with activity. Kitchen maids hurried past with trays. A young footman nearly collided with me as he rushed toward the front of the house. I pressed myself against the wall and tried to look as though I belonged. "Excuse me," a sharp voice said, and I turned to find a woman in a black dress regarding me with suspicious eyes. She was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair pulled back severely from her face and the unmistakable bearing of a housekeeper. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my kitchen?" I had prepared for this moment. I curtsied deeply. "Forgive me, ma'am. My name is Whitmore. I have come about the position." "What position?" The housekeeper's eyes narrowed. "We have no positions available." My heart sank, but I kept my expression calm. I was told there might be a need for a temporary lady's maid. It was a gamble. I had no references, of course, but I was counting on the housekeeper's natural curiosity, her desire to maintain order in her domain, to keep her talking long enough for me to think of another approach. "Told by whom?" she demanded. "I have advertised no such position." Before I could answer, a door at the end of the corridor opened and a man emerged. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway and dark hair that fell in careless waves across his forehead. His face was striking rather than handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a jaw that suggested stubbornness. But it was his eyes that caught me and held me, gray as winter clouds, gray as the London sky, gray as the stone walls of the house that had been his family's prison for 40 years. Those eyes swept over me with an expression I could not read, and I felt suddenly, acutely aware of my worn coat and my threadbare gloves and the lie I had been about to tell. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, and his voice was deep and quiet. the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed without raising itself. "What is happening here?" The housekeeper straightened. "Your Grace, this woman claims to be seeking a position we have not advertised. I was about to have her removed." "Your Grace." This was Nathaniel Pemberton, the Duke of Ashworth, the man I had come to find, the man whose family had suffered for 40 years because of the treasure hidden in my carriage, and I was standing before him in a servant's corridor, pretending to be something I was not. "Wait," he said, and his gray eyes returned to my face. There was something in his gaze, something sharp and assessing, as though he could see through my pretense to the truth beneath. "What is your name?" I could have lied. I should have lied. But something in those eyes made deception impossible. "Eloise Whitmore, Your Grace. And you are seeking a position as a lady's maid?" I swallowed. "I am seeking an audience with you, Your Grace. I have information that concerns your family, information of the utmost importance." The housekeeper made a sound of outrage. "Your Grace, I must insist that this woman be removed immediately. She is clearly not what she claims to be." "No," the Duke said slowly, "she is not." He took a step toward me, and I forced myself not to retreat. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared at a distance. I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the evidence of years of strain. I could see the carefully controlled tension in his shoulders, the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust easily. "You have 5 minutes, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Come with me." He turned and walked back through the door from which he had emerged. I followed, acutely aware of the housekeeper's disapproving gaze on my back, acutely aware of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The room beyond was a study, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. Papers were scattered across its surface. He did not sit himself, but stood by the window, his back to the gray morning light, his face in shadow. 5 minutes, he repeated. "Explain yourself." I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my mind, but now that it had arrived, all my carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. I took a deep breath and began. 2 days ago, I purchased a carriage at auction, an old state carriage, in very poor condition. I bought it because I had nowhere else to live, and I thought I could make a home of it. While cleaning it, I discovered a secret compartment hidden beneath one of the seats. The Duke's expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. "Go on." Inside the compartment, I found an object wrapped in silk. A tiara, made of diamonds, in a design of flowers and leaves. I believe it is the tiara that has been missing from the royal collection for 40 years. The tiara that your grandfather was accused of stealing. For a long moment, there was silence. The Duke stood motionless by the window, his face unreadable. Then he moved, crossing the room in 3 long strides to stand directly in front of my chair. "Do you know what you are saying?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but there was an intensity in it that made me press back against the chair. "Do you understand the gravity of this claim?" "I understand, Your Grace. I would not have come here if I were not certain." "Where is this tiara now?" "Hidden. In the carriage. I did not dare to move it." "And why have you come to me?" His eyes searched my face, looking for something I could not identify. "Why not go to the authorities? Why not sell it and disappear with the fortune it would bring? Because doing so would not clear your family's name. Because your grandfather was innocent, and I believe I have found proof of who truly stole the tiara. And because I had no wish to build my comfort on another family's pain." The Duke stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he moved back to the window and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the gray morning sky. "My grandfather died in exile," he said quietly. "My father spent his entire life trying to restore our family's reputation and failed. I have devoted the last 5 years to the same cause. And now you appear at my door, a stranger, claiming to have found the answer to 40 years of suffering hidden in a carriage you bought for 5 pounds. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. He turned to face me. I should have you arrested. I should call the authorities this very moment and have them take you into custody.
What do you mean?
My heart clenched, but I kept my
All
voice
the
steady.
answer with yes.
That is your right, Your Grace. But if you do, you will never learn the truth. The carriage will be
What?
impounded.
You
The
are
tiara will
giving the
disappear into some
thumbs
evidence vault,
before
and your family will
on
remain under suspicion forever.
my 5th anniversary.
You are very bold, Miss Whitmore.
And this is
I am
the-
desperate, Your Grace. But I am also honest. I have told you nothing but the truth. He studied me for another long
This is
moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled.
10 subs.
It was a small smile, barely a curve of his lips, but it transformed his face. The severity softened. The wariness faded. For just an instant, I caught a glimpse of the man he might have been if his life had taken a different path. Very well, Miss Whitmore. I will hear your evidence. But not here. If what you say is true, then this matter must be handled with the utmost discretion. Where is this carriage of yours? In an alley behind St. Martin's Church. I moved it there last night. Then we will go there now, together. He crossed to the door and opened it, calling for his coat and hat. The housekeeper appeared, her expression disapproving, but he waved away her concerns. I will return within the hour, Mrs. Blackwood. Please see that my appointments for this morning are postponed. We left Ashworth House through the servants' entrance, the Duke pulling on a plain dark coat that made him look more like a prosperous merchant than a peer of the realm. He walked quickly, with the long stride of a man accustomed to covering ground, and I had to hurry to keep pace. Tell me about this proof you mentioned, he said as we walked. You said you believe you know who truly stole the tiara. I told him about Cornelius Blackwood, about the warehouse where the carriage had been found, about my research at the British Library, and the discovery that Blackwood had worked at Buckingham Palace in 1857. The Duke listened in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. When I finished, he shook his head slowly. I know the name Blackwood, he said. Or rather, I know of him. He was questioned at the time of the theft, as were all the palace servants. But he had an alibi. He was seen in the servants' quarters during the time the tiara disappeared. Perhaps his alibi was false. Or perhaps he had an accomplice. Perhaps. The Duke's expression was thoughtful. Or perhaps he simply knew where to hide something and did not commit the theft himself. We reached the alley behind St. Martin's Church, and I led the Duke to where my carriage stood in the shadows. In the gray morning light, it looked even more decrepit than I remembered, a sad relic of a vanished age, its paint faded and its grandeur reduced to ruin. The Duke stopped a few feet away and stared at it. My God, he breathed. I know this carriage. I turned to him in surprise. You do. It was one of the state carriages used for royal processions during the early years of the Queen's reign. It was retired from service in the 1850s, around the time of the theft. I have seen drawings of it in the palace archives. He walked slowly around the carriage, running his hand along the faded paint. My grandfather must have seen it dozens of times. I opened the door and climbed inside, gesturing for him to follow. He hesitated for just a moment, then ducked his head and entered. The interior was dim, lit only by the gray light through the windows, but I could see his face clearly enough. He was looking around with an expression of wonder and sorrow, as though the carriage itself were a ghost from his family's past. The compartment is here, I said, kneeling beside the right-hand bench. I showed him where the velvet had been torn away, where the wooden panel had been pried loose. He knelt beside me, close enough that I could smell the clean scent of his soap and feel the warmth of his body in the confined space. I reached into the compartment and drew out the silk-wrapped bundle. My hands were trembling slightly as I unwrapped it, layer by layer, until the tiara lay exposed in my palms. The Duke made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. It is exactly as the drawings describe, he whispered, exactly as my grandfather described it in the letters he wrote from exile. He looked at me, and I was startled to see that his gray eyes were bright with unshed tears. You have found it. After 40 years, you have actually found it. I did not know what to say. I had expected suspicion, perhaps even anger. I had not expected this raw emotion, this vulnerability that he was making no effort to hide. Miss Whitmore, he said, and his voice was hoarse, I do not know how to thank you. I do not know if there are words sufficient to express what this means to me, to my family. You have not thanked me yet. Your Grace. We still do not know who stole it or why it was hidden here. Until we can prove your grandfather's innocence, the suspicion will remain. He nodded slowly, composing himself with visible effort. You are right. Of course. We must approach this carefully. He reached out and touched the tiara, his fingers tracing the diamond flowers with something like reverence. May I? I handed it to him, and he held it up to the dim light. The diamonds caught the glow and threw it back in 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced across the walls of the carriage. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply sat there in the silence, watching the light play across the surface of a treasure that had been lost for 40 years. I must think about how to proceed, he said at last, wrapping the tiara carefully in its silk covering once more. This must be handled with the utmost discretion. If word were to get out that the tiara had been found, if the press were to learn of it before we could prove how it came to be here, the scandal would be worse than before. I understand, Your Grace. He looked at me, and there was something new in his expression, something that might have been respect. You have been living in this carriage? I have nowhere else to go. His jaw tightened. That is unacceptable. You have brought me the greatest gift my family could ever receive, and you are living in an alley like a vagrant. He shook his head firmly. You will come to Ashworth House. We have rooms that stand empty. You will stay there while we investigate this matter. Your Grace, I cannot possibly accept such an offer. It would not be proper. Proper? He raised an eyebrow. Miss Whitmore, you have just handed me proof that my grandfather was innocent of a crime that destroyed his life. You have given me the means to restore my family's honor after 40 years of shame. Do you truly think I care about propriety at this moment? I did not know how to answer. The offer was beyond generous. It was also dangerous. I was a woman alone, without family or protector. To stay in the house of an unmarried man, even one as highborn as the Duke, would ruin whatever remained of my reputation. But what reputation did I have left to protect? I was a homeless governess, living in a carriage, with nothing to my name but the clothes on my back and a secret that could change everything. I will accept your offer, Your Grace, I said finally, but only until this matter is resolved. Agreed. He tucked the wrapped tiara inside his coat and moved toward the door of the carriage. Come, let us return to Ashworth House. There is much work to be done. He climbed out and offered me his hand. I took it, feeling the warmth of his fingers through my thin gloves, and stepped down into the gray morning. I did not know it then, but that single touch set in motion events that would alter both our lives forever. That morning, walking beside the Duke of Ashworth, I knew only that I was no longer alone. For the first time in weeks, I had hope. And hope, I was learning, could be the most dangerous thing of all. I had never slept in a bed so soft, nor woken to a room so silent. The chamber the Duke had given me was on the 3rd floor of Ashworth House, small by aristocratic standards, but larger than any room I had ever called my own. The walls were papered in pale blue, the furniture was polished mahogany, and the window looked out over the quiet square below. After 3 nights in a carriage and 3 weeks in a drafty boarding house, it felt like waking in a dream. That first morning at Ashworth House, I lay in bed for a long moment, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. 2 days ago, I had been homeless, penniless, without hope. Now I was a guest in a duke's residence. My carriage had been moved to the Ashworth stables, and I was about to embark on an investigation that could restore a family's honor after 40 years of shame. It seemed impossible. And yet, here I was. A knock at the door roused me from my thoughts. A young housemaid entered with a tray of tea and toast, her eyes wide with curiosity that she was trying hard to conceal. Mrs. Blackwood had clearly not shared any details about my presence, but the servants would be speculating. A strange woman arriving with the Duke, being given a guest room, dining alone in her chamber rather than with the family. It was the stuff of gossip, and I knew better than anyone how quickly gossip could spread through a household. His Grace requests your presence in the library at 10 o'clock, the maid said, setting the tray on a small table by the window. Shall I help you dress, miss? I looked down at my worn gray dress, the only garment I possessed aside from the clothes on my back. I had washed it as best I could the night before, but it was still clearly not suitable for a duke's library. Thank you, but I can manage. The maid curtsied and left, and I ate my breakfast in silence, watching the morning light creep across the square below. Carriages passed. A nursemaid walked by with her charges. The world continued its ordinary business, unaware that somewhere in this house, a tiara worth £1 million was hidden in a locked drawer, waiting to change everything. At precisely 10 o'clock, I descended to the library. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories tall, with bookshelves climbing to a ceiling painted with clouds and cherubs. A fire burned in the marble fireplace, casting warm light across the leather chairs and the Persian carpet. The Duke was standing by one of the tall windows, his back to me, gazing out at the garden below. He turned when he heard me enter, and I was struck again by how different he looked in the morning light. The severity I had seen yesterday was still there, in the set of his jaw and the sharpness of his gaze. But there was something else now, too. A warmth, perhaps. Or maybe just the absence of suspicion. Good morning, Miss Whitmore. I trust you slept well? Better than I have in weeks, Your Grace. I am grateful for your hospitality. He gestured to a chair near the fire, and I sat, folding my hands in my lap. He remained standing, pacing slowly before the hearth, like a man with too much energy and no outlet for it. I have been thinking, he said, about how to proceed. We cannot simply walk into Scotland Yard and present the tiara. There would be questions we cannot answer. The authorities would want to know how you came to possess it, why you did not report it immediately, and why you came to me instead of to them. I nodded. I had thought of all this myself. They would suspect us both. Precisely. And suspicion, once raised, is difficult to dispel. My family knows that better than most. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. No, we must build a case first. We must prove beyond any doubt that the tiara was stolen by someone other than my grandfather, and we must identify that person by name. Cornelius Blackwood, I said. Perhaps. The Duke's expression was thoughtful, but perhaps not. You said he had an alibi for the night of the theft. If that alibi holds, then he cannot have taken the tiara himself. He must have had help, an accomplice. Yes, someone who could access the vault, take the tiara, and pass it to Blackwood to hide. He resumed his pacing. The question is, who? Who had access to the royal vault that night? Who had reason to want my grandfather destroyed? I considered this. Was there anyone who bore your grandfather ill will? A rival, perhaps? An enemy? The Duke laughed, but there was no humor in it. My grandfather was one of the most trusted men in the Queen's household. He had served the crown for 20 years without a single mark against his name. If he had enemies, I never knew of them. He shook his head, but someone wanted him destroyed. Someone planned this theft carefully, knowing that he would be blamed. Then we must look at who benefited from his fall. The Duke stopped mid-stride and stared at me. I felt my cheeks warm under his scrutiny. but I held his gaze.
Should the
That is an
guest
excellent
get
point, Miss
turn
Whitmore.
base? Where should the
He moved to a
friend?
desk in the
The
corner and
Governess,
began
I don't
rifling
have
through
it on my
papers.
PC.
After my grandfather fled to the continent, his position at court was vacant. His estates were sold to pay the debts he incurred trying to clear his name. His social standing evaporated. Someone must have gained from all of that. He pulled out a leather-bound journal and began flipping through its pages. This is my grandfather's diary, one of the few possessions he took with him into exile.
Why
My
not?
father
Because
preserved it,
what the
and I have read it many
because it's
times, searching for some clue to his innocence. But
because what
perhaps I was looking in the wrong places. He brought the journal to the chair beside mine and sat down, closer than propriety strictly allowed. I could smell his cologne, something subtle and masculine, and I found myself acutely aware of his proximity. Here, he said, opening the journal to a page near the middle. He writes about the night of the ball, the night the tiara disappeared. He read aloud, his voice low and measured. The ball was a magnificent success. Her Majesty was radiant, and the tiara sparkled like a constellation upon her brow. I was honored to be entrusted with returning it to the vault, a task I performed with the utmost care. I handed the case to the footman, as was the usual procedure, and watched him carry it toward the vault room. I thought nothing more of it until the following morning, when I was awakened by officers of the palace guard. The Duke looked up at me. He handed it to a footman. He names the footman elsewhere in the diary, a man called Thomas Harding. And this Thomas Harding was never found. He vanished that night. The palace searched for him for months, but he was never located. It was assumed he had fled the country with the tiara, but the tiara was never with him. It was hidden in the carriage all along. The Duke nodded slowly, which means Thomas Harding either hid it there himself, or he gave it to someone who did, someone like Cornelius Blackwood. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us thinking through the implications. Then the Duke rose and returned to the desk, pulling out another sheaf of papers. I have been attempting to trace Blackwood's history, he said. Before you came to me, I knew nothing of the man, but I have connections, resources. I have already sent inquiries to the palace archives and to the Metropolitan Police, and what have you learned? Not much yet, but I did discover one interesting fact. He turned to face me, his gray eyes intent. Cornelius Blackwood had a sister, a woman named Margaret Blackwood, and Margaret Blackwood was, for a brief time, employed at Buckingham Palace as a lady's maid. I felt a chill run down my spine. A lady's maid would have access to the private quarters, and potentially to the vault room. The Duke's voice was grim. I have not yet been able to confirm this, but if Margaret Blackwood was working at the palace on the night of the theft, and if she had any connection to Thomas Harding, then we may have found our answer. Do we know what happened to her? No. After 1857, there are no records of her at all. She disappears from history as completely as Thomas Harding did. Perhaps they disappeared together. Perhaps. The Duke crossed back to where I sat and looked down at me with an expression I could not quite read. Miss Whitmore, I must ask you something, and I hope you will answer me honestly. Of course, Your Grace. Why are you helping me? The question surprised me. I beg your pardon? He sat down in the chair beside me again, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You found a treasure worth £1 million. You could have sold it and lived in comfort for the rest of your life. Instead, you sought me out, a stranger, and handed me the key to my family's redemption. Why? I looked at him for a long moment, at the sharp planes of his face and the intensity in his gray eyes. I thought about the question, about the many answers I could give, because it was the right thing to do, because I could not profit from another family's pain, because I had been raised to value honesty above all else. All of those answers were true, but they were not the whole truth. Because I know what it is like to be judged for something you did not do, I said finally. Because I have spent my life in the shadows of other people's houses, invisible and powerless, watching the wealthy and the titled move through the world with ease
Actually,
while I
who's the
scraped and
top?
struggled
Wait,
for every small dignity.
you're the top?
Because your grandfather
Tiara?
died in exile, his name
Can you talk
destroyed,
to me then?
his family shamed, and he was innocent. I could not stand by and allow that injustice to continue
You
when I had the
play
power
one
to end
game,
it.
yes, I'll support.
The
Wait,
Duke
what
was silent
are you
for a
guys
long
actually
moment.
talking about?
Then slowly, he reached out and took my hand. It was an improper gesture, and we both knew it. A duke does not hold the hand of an unmarried woman who is not his relation, but his fingers were warm around mine, and his touch was gentle, and I found that I did not want him to let go.
Like a
"You are
hero?
a remarkable woman, Eloise Whitmore," he said softly, "and I am more grateful than I can express." I felt heat rise
It's
to my
sleek,
cheeks.
never mind.
"Your
Wait,
Grace,"
you
I
guys.
began, but he shook his head. "Nathaniel. When we are alone, please call me Nathaniel." My heart was beating so fast, I was certain he could hear it. "Nathaniel," I whispered, and his name felt like a secret on my lips. We sat there for a moment, his hand in mine, the fire crackling beside us. Then a knock at the library door broke the spell, and we sprang apart like guilty children. "Enter," the Duke called, and his voice was
Only how
steady,
many people
betraying
play
nothing of what had just passed between us.
True. It's
Mrs.
true.
Blackwood appeared in the doorway, her expression disapproving as always. "Your Grace, there is a gentleman here to see you. He says it is a matter of some urgency. Who is he?" "He would not give his name, Your Grace, but he says he has information about the Pemberton matter." The Duke and I exchanged a glance. "Send him in," he said. The man who entered the library was old, perhaps 70 or more, with a stooped posture and a face lined by years of hard living. His clothes were
Good
shabby
boy.
but clean, and he clutched a worn cap in his gnarled hands, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were bright and sharp, filled with an intelligence that belied his humble appearance. "Your Grace," the old man said, bowing stiffly, "I apologize for intruding. My name is Samuel Harding. Thomas Harding was my brother." The Duke went very still. I felt my own breath catch in my throat. "Your brother," the Duke said slowly, "was the footman who disappeared with the Queen's tiara." "My brother," the old man replied, "was murdered for refusing to be part of a crime." He looked from the Duke to me and back again, and when he spoke next, his voice was heavy with 40 years of silence finally broken. "I know who stole the tiara," he said. "I have always known, and I have come to tell you everything." The Duke gestured to a chair. "Please, Mr. Harding, sit down." The old man lowered himself into the chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints had long since begun to fail him. He was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts, and I found myself holding my breath. "My brother Thomas was a good man," he began at last. "Honest, hard-working. He had been in service at the palace for nearly 10 years when it happened. He was proud of his position, proud to serve the Queen." He looked up at the Duke with rheumy eyes. "He would never have stolen anything. Never." "Then what happened to him?" "He was approached by a woman, a lady's maid named Margaret. She worked in the private quarters, had access to places most servants could not go. She told him she had a plan to take the tiara, that it would be easy, that they could both be rich beyond imagining. He refused, told her he wanted no part of it, but she went ahead with the plan anyway." The old man nodded. "She had a brother, worked in the carriage house. Between the two of them, they knew the palace routines, knew when the tiara would be vulnerable. They just needed someone to hand it off to them, someone who would be above suspicion." "Thomas," I said softly. "Thomas." Samuel Harding's voice was bitter. She tried to convince him, offered him money, offered him other things. When he refused, she threatened him, said if he did not help, she would tell the palace authorities that he had been stealing for years. It would be her word against his, and she had friends in high places. So he agreed? No. He refused again, told her to do her worst. The old man's hands tightened on his cap. "So she did worse." "What do you mean?" Samuel Harding looked at the Duke, then at me, and his eyes were haunted. On the night of the ball, Thomas was supposed to hand the tiara case to the vault keeper, but Margaret got to him first. She had drugged his tea, made him confused and disoriented. When His Grace's grandfather handed him the case, Thomas walked toward the vault as usual, but Margaret intercepted him in the corridor, took the case, and left him standing there in a daze. And the tiara! Her brother was waiting with one of the carriages. She passed the case to him, and he hid it in a secret compartment he had discovered. They planned to retrieve it later, once the fuss had died down. But something went wrong, I said. Everything went wrong. When Thomas came to his senses and realized what had happened, he tried to tell the authorities. But Margaret had already spread her story, already pointed fingers at the Duke's grandfather. And Thomas, the old man's voice broke. Thomas tried to confront her. She had him killed, made it look like he had fled the country with the tiara. My God, the Duke breathed. I never knew what happened to the tiara itself, Samuel continued. Margaret told my brother it would be hidden somewhere safe, but she never told him where. When Thomas died, I thought the secret had died with him. I spent 40 years in silence, afraid that if I spoke, the same thing would happen to me. Why are you speaking now? The old man looked up, and there were tears on his weathered cheeks. Because I am dying, he said simply. The doctors give me weeks, perhaps a month, and I cannot go to my grave with this weight on my conscience. I cannot let my brother be remembered as a thief when he was a victim. His gaze moved to the Duke. I cannot let your family suffer any longer for a crime they did not commit. The library was silent. The fire crackled. Outside, the sounds of London continued, oblivious to the revelation that had just shattered 40 years of lies. The Duke rose slowly and crossed to where the old man sat. He knelt before him, taking his gnarled hands in his own. Mr. Harding, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, you have given me a gift beyond price. I swear to you on my family's honor that your brother's name will be cleared alongside my grandfather's. The truth will be known. The old man wept then, silent tears streaming down his face, and I wept too, quietly, for the brothers who had suffered, for the family that had been destroyed, and for the justice that was finally, after 40 long years, within reach. We had our answers now. We knew who had stolen the tiara. We knew why it had been hidden, and why it had never been retrieved. All that remained was to prove it. The days that followed Samuel Harding's revelation were a blur of research, correspondence, and long conversations by the fire. Nathaniel threw himself into the investigation with a passion that bordered on obsession, writing letters to archivists and historians, poring over old palace records, searching for any trace of Margaret Blackwood and what had become of her after 1857. I helped where I could. My years with Lady Cresswell had given me skills that proved useful. I could read quickly and retain information. I could organize documents and cross-reference dates. I could spot inconsistencies in testimony and records. We worked together in the library, sometimes in silence, broken only by the scratch of pen on paper and the crackle of the fire, sometimes debating theories and possibilities late into the night. And with each passing day, I felt the distance between us narrowing, felt the walls we had both built around ourselves beginning to crumble. It was improper, of course. Everything about my situation was improper. I was an unmarried woman living in the house of an unmarried man, spending my days in his company without a chaperone, calling him by his Christian name when we were alone. Mrs. Blackwood watched me with disapproval that she made no effort to conceal. The other servants whispered when they thought I could not hear. If society knew, I would be ruined beyond repair. But society did not know, and I found to my surprise that I cared less about propriety than I had ever thought possible. What I cared about was him, Nathaniel, the way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating, a deep line forming between his eyes, the way his gray eyes lit up when he discovered a new piece of evidence, transforming his severe face into something almost boyish. The way he listened when I spoke, truly listened. leaning forward with his full attention, as though my thoughts and opinions mattered as much as any lord's. In all my years of service, no one had ever treated me as his equal. No one had ever made me feel that I was worth knowing, worth hearing, worth caring about. It was dangerous, this feeling. I knew it could lead nowhere good. He was a duke, heir to one of the oldest titles in England, and I was a penniless governess without family or fortune. Even if he felt something for me, and I was not certain he did, the gulf between our stations was too vast to bridge. Society would never accept it. His family, what remained of it, would never accept it. I told myself this every night as I lay in my soft bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the sleeping house. I told myself to guard my heart, to remember my place, to expect nothing. But the heart does not listen to reason. The heart wants what it wants. On the 5th day of our investigation, a letter arrived that changed everything. Nathaniel had written to the parish records office in Southwark, requesting any information about Cornelius Blackwood and his family. The response came that morning, delivered by a messenger who waited in the hall, while Nathaniel tore open the envelope and read its contents. I watched his face as he read. I saw his expression shift from anticipation to confusion, to something that looked almost like triumph. "Eloise," he said, and the urgency in his voice brought me to my feet. "Come and look at this." I crossed to where he stood by the window and read over his shoulder. The letter was from a clerk at the parish office, a Mr. Simmons, who had found several documents related to the Blackwood family in his records. The first document was a baptismal record for Cornelius Blackwood, born 1820, son of William and Mary Blackwood. The second was a similar record for his sister Margaret, born 1825. Nothing surprising there. But the third document made my breath catch in my throat. It was a marriage certificate. Margaret Blackwood, spinster, had married Thomas Harding, bachelor, in a small ceremony at St. George's Church in Southwark on the 15th of March, 1857, just 4 months before the tiara disappeared. "She married him," I whispered. "Margaret married Thomas Harding." Nathaniel nodded, his jaw tight, which means everything Samuel told us was even more complicated than we realized. She was not just a colleague trying to recruit an accomplice. She was his wife. I thought through the implications. If they were married, then Thomas would have been even more reluctant to expose her. He would have been protecting his wife, not just a fellow servant. And it explains why he did not simply go to the authorities when she threatened him, Nathaniel added. To accuse his own wife of theft would have meant her hanging. He was trying to stop her without destroying her, but she destroyed him instead. Yes. Nathaniel's voice was heavy. She murdered her own husband to protect herself and her brother. We stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the horror of it. Then Nathaniel turned back to the letter. "There is more," he said. Mr. Simmons found one other document, a death certificate. For Margaret? For Margaret Harding, née Blackwood. She died in 1862, 5 years after the theft. The cause of death is listed as consumption. I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that the woman who had caused so much suffering was long dead, unable to harm anyone else. Sadness that she had escaped justice, dying in her bed rather than facing the consequences of her terrible crimes. And frustration that we could not question her, could not force her to confess, could not look into her eyes and demand to know why she had destroyed so many innocent lives. "She is beyond our reach," I said. "Yes, but her brother was not." Nathaniel moved to the desk and began gathering papers. Cornelius Blackwood lived until 6 months ago. He had the tiara in his warehouse for nearly 40 years. He must have known what his sister had done. He must have kept records, evidence, something that would explain why he never retrieved the treasure. "We need to search the warehouse," I said. "No, we need to search his estate." He paused, looking up at me. "When a man dies, his possessions go somewhere. His papers, his correspondence, his personal effects. If Cornelius Blackwood kept any record of his sister's crime, it would be among those things. The solicitors, I said, remembering the sign I had seen on the warehouse door. Thornton and Associates. They were handling his estate. Nathaniel smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in days. Then that is where we will go. The offices of Thornton and Associates were located in a narrow building on a cramped street near the Inns of Court. It was not an elegant establishment, the kind frequented by wealthy clients with lucrative estates, but it had the air of quiet competence that marked successful legal practices. The floors were worn but polished, the walls lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes, and the smell of old paper and ink hung in the air like a familiar perfume. A clerk led us to a small waiting room, where we sat on hard wooden chairs and waited in tense silence. I was acutely aware of Nathaniel beside me, of the tension in his shoulders and the way his fingers drummed restlessly against his knee. We were so close to the answers we sought, so close to the truth that had eluded his family for 4 decades. After what felt like an eternity, a door opened and a man emerged. Mr. Thornton was perhaps 60, with a fringe of white hair around a bald head and spectacles perched on a long nose. He moved with the deliberate care of a man who had spent his life among documents and depositions. He looked at us with the wary expression of someone who has learned to be suspicious of unexpected visitors, particularly when one of them is a duke. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Nathaniel, "this is an unexpected honor. How may I assist you?" Nathaniel rose and shook the solicitor's hand. "Thank you for seeing us without an appointment, Mr. Thornton. I am here regarding the estate of Cornelius Blackwood." The solicitor's expression became guarded. "I am afraid I cannot discuss the details of a client's estate, Your Grace, even a deceased client. I understand your discretion, and I respect it. But I believe Mr. Blackwood may have possessed documents that relate to a matter of great importance to my family. Documents that could prove my grandfather's innocence in the theft of the Queen's tiara 40 years ago." Mr. Thornton's eyebrows rose. "That is a significant claim, Your Grace. I would not make it lightly." Nathaniel's voice was steady, his gaze direct. "I have evidence that Cornelius Blackwood's sister, Margaret, was the true thief. I believe her brother knew of her crime and may have kept records that would confirm this. If such records exist among his effects, I must see them." The solicitor was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. Then he sighed. "Come with me," he said. He led us down a narrow corridor to a small room at the back of the building. It was filled with boxes, stacked from floor to ceiling, each one labeled with a name and date. "The Blackwood Estate," Mr. Thornton said, gesturing to a corner where 6 boxes sat gathering dust. Mr. Blackwood had no heirs and no will. His possessions were to be sold to cover his debts, but there has been little interest. The boxes contain his personal papers, correspondence, and various documents that were found in his warehouse and lodgings. May we examine them? Mr. Thornton hesitated, then nodded. I suppose there can be no harm in it. The estate is to be liquidated regardless. If you find anything of value, I ask only that you inform me so that proper procedures may be followed. Of course. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. The solicitor left us alone with the boxes, and Nathaniel and I set to work. It was tedious labor. Cornelius Blackwood had been a hoarder of papers, keeping receipts and invoices and letters dating back decades. We sorted through accounts of his antiquities business, correspondence with customers and suppliers, bills for rent and food and coal, nothing that related to the tiara, nothing that mentioned his sister at all. Hours passed. The light from the small window shifted and faded. My back ached from bending over boxes, and my eyes stung from squinting at faded handwriting. I was beginning to lose hope when Nathaniel made a sound. "Eloise," he said, "look at this." He was holding a small leather journal, its cover cracked and worn. I moved to his side and looked at the page he had opened. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but the words were clear enough. March 1857. Margaret has done a terrible thing. She has stolen from the Queen herself, and she has made me her accomplice. She brought me the case in the night and begged me to hide it. She said it was only temporary, that she would retrieve it once the search had ended. I did not want to help her, but she is my sister. I could not refuse. I turned the page, my hands trembling. June 1857. Thomas is dead. Margaret says it was necessary, that he would have exposed us, but I cannot forgive her. He was her husband. He was a good man, and she killed him as easily as swatting a fly. I am afraid of what she has become. And further on, August 1857, the Duke of Ashworth has fled to the continent. They say he took the tiara with him, that he was the thief all along, but I know the truth. The tiara is hidden in the old state carriage, in the secret compartment I discovered when I was cleaning it years ago. Margaret made me promise never to retrieve it, never to sell it, never to speak of it. She says the risk is too great, but I think she simply cannot bear to profit from her husband's death. Nathaniel's hands were shaking as he turned to the final entries. 1862. Margaret is dead. The consumption took her slowly, painfully. In her final days, she begged me to destroy the tiara, to throw it in the Thames and be done with it forever. But I cannot. It is evidence of her crime, yes, but it is also evidence of the Duke's innocence. Perhaps someday, someone will find it. Perhaps someday, the truth will come out. And the last entry, dated only weeks before Blackwood's death, 1897. I am dying. The doctors say I have only months to live. I have kept my sister's secret for 40 years, and it has eaten away at my soul. I should have spoken. I should have given the tiara to the authorities and let justice be done. But I was afraid, and I was loyal, and now it is too late. The carriage is being sold with the rest of my possessions. Perhaps it will end up in some collector's warehouse, forgotten forever. Or perhaps, by some miracle, the truth will finally be found. I looked up at Nathaniel, and I saw tears streaming down his face. "We have it," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We have everything we need." I reached out and took his hand, not caring about propriety, not caring about anything except the man before me and the justice we had finally found after so many years of searching and suffering. "It is over," I said softly. "Your grandfather will be vindicated. Your family's honor will be restored." He looked at me, and in his gray eyes, I saw something that made my heart stop. "Eloise," he said, "I could not have done this without you." And then he kissed me. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and fierce and full of all the emotion we had both been holding back for days. His hands cupped my face. His lips moved against mine, and I felt myself dissolving into him, losing myself in the warmth and the want and the impossible, improbable joy of this moment. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. His forehead rested against mine, and his hands still cradled my face. "I know I should not have done that," he whispered. "I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is impossible, but I do not care. Eloise, I have fallen in love with you." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely speak. "Nathaniel," I breathed, "I love you too." He kissed me again, softer this time, a promise rather than a demand. And in that dusty room surrounded by boxes of a dead man's secrets, I felt something I had never felt before. I felt hope. Not just for justice, not just for truth, but for a future I had never dared to imagine. A future with him. The next morning, Nathaniel sent word to Buckingham Palace requesting an audience with Her Majesty's private secretary. He enclosed copies of Cornelius Blackwood's journal entries and a summary of Samuel Harding's testimony. He explained that the missing tiara had been found, that the true thieves had been identified, and that the Pemberton family wished to return the treasure to its rightful owner and clear their name once and for all. The response came within hours, faster than either of us had dared to hope. Her Majesty would receive the Duke of Ashworth the following day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I would go with him. I had never imagined I would stand inside Buckingham Palace. In all my dreams, in all my fantasies of a different life, this possibility had never occurred to me. And yet, here I was, walking through corridors that had witnessed centuries of history, my hand resting lightly on Nathaniel's arm, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain the footmen lining the walls could hear it. The palace was overwhelming in its grandeur. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across ceilings, painted with angels and clouds. Portraits of kings and queens gazed down from gilded frames. The carpet beneath our feet was so thick and soft that our footsteps made no sound at all. I felt like a trespasser, an intruder in a world where I did not belong. But Nathaniel walked beside me as though he belonged here, as though these halls were as familiar to him as the rooms of Ashworth House. And perhaps they were. His family had served the crown for generations, had walked these same corridors, had stood in these same chambers, until 40 years ago, when everything had been taken from them. Today, we would take it back. We were led to a small reception room, intimate by palace standards, but still larger than any room I had ever seen in a private home. The walls were hung with silk, the color of fresh cream, and tall windows looked out over the palace gardens, where autumn leaves drifted lazily to the ground. A fire burned in the marble fireplace, and before it sat a small figure in black. Queen Victoria was smaller than I had expected. She was 78 years old, widowed for 36 years, and the weight of her reign showed in every line of her face. But her eyes were sharp and clear, missing nothing as we entered the room and made our obeisances. This was the woman who had ruled an empire for 60 years, who had survived assassination attempts and personal tragedies, who had shaped the world with her will and her vision. I had never felt so insignificant in my life. "Rise," she said, and her voice was stronger than her frail appearance suggested. "Come closer. My eyes are not what they once were." We approached, and I saw her gaze move from Nathaniel to me with undisguised curiosity. Nathaniel had explained my presence in his letter to the palace, describing me as the woman who had discovered the tiara and conducted much of the investigation. But I knew that my presence here was unusual, perhaps unprecedented. A governess, standing beside a duke in the Queen's private chambers. "You are the Duke of Ashworth," the Queen said, her eyes returning to Nathaniel. "Your grandfather served us faithfully for many years, until the unpleasantness." "Yes, Your Majesty." Nathaniel's voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "I have come to prove that the unpleasantness was not of his making." The Queen was silent for a moment, her fingers tapping slowly against the arm of her chair. "We have read your letter. We have examined the documents you sent. They are compelling, but we would hear the story from your own lips." Nathaniel began to speak. He told the story from the beginning, from my purchase of the carriage at auction to the discovery of the tiara, from the revelation of Cornelius Blackwood's connection to the palace to Samuel Harding's testimony about his brother's murder. He spoke clearly and precisely, presenting the evidence with the skill of a barrister making his case before a judge. But it was the journal that captured the Queen's attention. She held out her hand, and Nathaniel placed Cornelius Blackwood's journal into her palm. She opened it to the pages we had marked, the pages where Blackwood had confessed to hiding the tiara, where he had written of his sister's crime and his own guilt. She read in silence, her expression unreadable, and the room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "We remember that night," she said softly. "We remember wearing the tiara, feeling its weight upon our head. We remember thinking how beautiful it was, how perfectly Prince Albert had chosen." She paused, and I saw her hand tremble slightly as she touched the page. "We remember the morning after, when we were told it was gone. We remember the search, the accusations, the scandal. We remember the Duke of Ashworth, your grandfather, swearing his innocence as the world turned against him." "He was innocent, Your Majesty," Nathaniel said, and his voice cracked slightly. "He died in exile, still protesting his innocence. My father spent his entire life trying to clear our name. I have devoted my own life to the same cause. And now, at last, we have the truth. The Queen closed the journal and handed it back to Nathaniel. Then she turned her gaze to me. And you, she said, Miss Whitmore, you found the tiara.
No, because
You could have sold it and lived comfortably for the rest of your days. Why did you not? I took a deep breath, acutely aware of the weight of her attention. Because it was not mine to sell, Your Majesty. Because the Duke's family had suffered for a crime they did not commit. Because I could not build my happiness on the foundation of another's pain. The Queen studied me for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. You have an honest heart, Miss Whitmore. It is a rare quality in this world. She turned back to Nathaniel. We are satisfied. The evidence is clear. Roland Pemberton, the late Duke of Ashworth, was innocent of the theft of our tiara. The true culprits were Margaret Blackwood and her brother Cornelius. We shall issue a formal proclamation to that effect. Nathaniel closed his eyes, and I saw the tension drain from his body. Thank you, Your Majesty. You cannot know what this means to my family. We believe we can. The Queen's voice was gentle. We have lived long enough to understand the weight of reputation, the pain of unjust accusation. We are glad to see this wrong finally righted. She paused. But there is the matter of the tiara itself. I have brought it, Your Majesty. Nathaniel reached into the leather case he had carried with him and withdrew the silk-wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the diamonds blazing in the afternoon light. The Queen gasped, a small sound that seemed to escape her against her will. Her hand reached out, trembling, and touched the delicate metalwork. We have not seen it in 40 years, she whispered. We thought we never would again. She looked up at Nathaniel, and there were tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Thank you, Your Grace. Thank you for returning what was lost. Nathaniel bowed his head. It belongs to you, Your Majesty. It always has. The Queen held the tiara for a long moment, turning it in her hands, watching the light dance across the diamonds. Then she set it aside and turned her attention back to us. We wish to reward you, she said, both of you. The Duke of Ashworth shall be restored to full favor at court. Your family's lands, those that were sold to pay your grandfather's debts, we shall see what can be done to restore them. And you, Miss Whitmore, I felt my heart skip. Your Majesty, you have done the crown a great service. You have returned a treasure beyond price and righted a terrible wrong. We wish to grant you a pension sufficient to keep you in comfort for the remainder of your days, and we wish to know if there is anything else we might do for you. I glanced at Nathaniel, and he gave me the smallest of nods. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. There is one thing. Your Majesty, I said, and my voice was barely above a whisper. Name it. I looked at Nathaniel, at the man who had become everything to me in the space of a few short weeks. I looked at the Queen, who held in her hands the power to grant or deny what I was about to ask. And I took the greatest risk of my life. The Duke of Ashworth has done me the honor of asking for my hand in marriage, I said. We know that such a union would be unusual, that it would defy convention and expectation. But we love each other, Your Majesty. And if it please you, we would ask your blessing on our union. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. The Queen looked from me to Nathaniel and back again. Her expression was unreadable, her thoughts hidden behind decades of royal composure. I held my breath, waiting for the rejection I knew must come, waiting for her to tell us that such a marriage was impossible, that a duke could not wed a governess, that the social order must be preserved. But she surprised me. Love, she said softly, and her voice was filled with a sadness that spoke of long years of grief. We know something of love, Miss Whitmore. We know what it is to find a partner who completes you, who makes you more than you could ever be alone. We lost our own dear Albert 36 years ago, and not a day passes that we do not feel his absence. She looked at Nathaniel with something that might have been recognition. Your grandfather served at our wedding. Did you know that?
Here.
He carried the train of our gown. We remember him as a young man, full of hope and promise. He deserved better than the fate that befell him. Yes, Your Majesty, Nathaniel said quietly. He did. The Queen nodded slowly. Society will talk. There will be scandal, gossip, disapproval. But we have learned in our long reign that society often talks about the wrong things. What matters is not birth or station. What matters is character. And Miss Whitmore has shown herself to possess character of the highest order. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw warmth in her eyes. You have our blessing, Miss Whitmore. Marry your duke. Be happy. And when society whispers, remind them that the Queen herself approved. I could not speak. Tears were streaming down my face, and I could not find the words to express what I felt. But Nathaniel spoke for both of us. Thank you, Your Majesty, he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. We are more grateful than we can say. The audience ended shortly after. We made our obeisances, we collected our documents and our dignity, and we walked out of Buckingham Palace into the cool November afternoon. The sky was clear for once, a pale winter blue that seemed to promise better days ahead. When we were safely in the carriage, away from the eyes of footmen and guards and curious passers-by, Nathaniel pulled me into his arms and kissed me thoroughly. She said yes, he murmured against my lips. I cannot believe she said yes. Neither can I. I laughed, giddy with relief and joy and 1,000 other emotions I could not name. Nathaniel, we are going to be married. Yes, we are. He pulled back to look at me, his gray eyes shining. I am going to marry you, Eloise Whitmore. I am going to make you a duchess. And I am going to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice. I did not need convincing. I had known from the moment he took my hand in the library that I would follow him anywhere. But I let him convince me anyway, there in the carriage, with his lips on mine and his arms around me and the whole glorious future stretching out before us. The wedding took place in the spring, when the gardens of Ashworth House were bursting with flowers and the air was sweet with the promise of new beginnings. It was a small ceremony, intimate and private, attended only by those who mattered most. Samuel Harding was there, frail but smiling, having lived to see justice done and his brother's name cleared at last. Mrs. Blackwood was there too, her disapproval finally softened into something approaching acceptance. And in the front pew sat a small figure in black, accompanied by a retinue of ladies-in-waiting and guards. The Queen herself had come to see us wed. I walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, my heart so full I thought it might overflow. Nathaniel waited for me at the altar, his gray eyes bright with tears he did not bother to hide. When I reached him, he took my hand and held it as though he never intended to let go. I love you, he whispered, soft enough that only I could hear. I love you too, I whispered back. Always. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. We spoke our vows with voices that trembled. We exchanged rings that gleamed in the candlelight. And when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed me with a tenderness that made me forget there was anyone else in the world. Afterward, there was a reception in the grand ballroom, with champagne and music and more happiness than I had ever known. I danced with my husband, feeling the warmth of his hand on my waist and the steadiness of his gaze holding mine. I danced until my feet ached and my cheeks hurt from smiling, and still I did not want to stop. Late in the evening, the Queen approached us. She moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. You make a handsome couple, she said. We are pleased. Thank you, Your Majesty, I said, curtsying, for everything. She reached out and touched my cheek, a gesture so unexpected and so tender that it brought fresh tears to my eyes. Be happy, she said. That is all the thanks we require. And then she was gone, swept away by her attendants, leaving us alone in the middle of the crowded room. Nathaniel pulled me close. Shall we escape? He murmured against my ear. I thought you would never ask. We slipped away from the party, climbing the grand staircase to the private quarters above. The room that awaited us was the master suite, newly decorated in shades of blue and cream, with a fire burning in the grate and candles casting soft light across the silk-covered bed. Nathaniel closed the door behind us and turned to face me. "Hello, wife," he said, and his smile was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Hello, husband," I replied and went into his arms. Outside, the stars were emerging, scattered across the London sky like diamonds on velvet. Somewhere in the palace, tucked away in the royal vault where it belonged, a tiara sparkled in the darkness, finally home after 40 years of waiting. And in a quiet room in Mayfair, two people who had found each other against all odds began their new life together. I had come to London with nothing. No money, no family, no hope. I had bought a ruined carriage with my last £5, intending to live in it like a vagrant. And in that carriage, hidden beneath velvet worn thin by time, I had found a treasure that changed everything. Not the tiara. That treasure had always belonged to another. The treasure I found was love. The treasure I found was purpose. The treasure I found was a man who saw me as I truly was and loved me anyway. A man who would stand beside me through scandal and triumph, through hardship and joy, for all the days of our lives. Some might call it luck, some might call it fate, but I prefer to think of it as something else. I prefer to think of it as grace, the grace of a moment, the grace of a choice, the grace of two hearts finding each other in the darkness and holding on tight. That is the story of how I, Eloise Whitmore, governess without prospects or fortune, became the Duchess of Ashworth. That is the story of how I found my home. And if you ask me, it is the only treasure that ever truly mattered.